So here we go. Sorry for the mess, but as you probably all know, I am no longer the artistic director of Infinite Theatre. Zach Fraser is, and we passed it off last Friday, and so I'm just rearranging my books here out in the country, staying away from viruses. I'm a very lucky person. I can get a bit of skiing in and so on out the front door. So I'm very lucky. And I hope everybody else is keeping safe and healthy. So we left off the last time. I just come back from Europe with a fistful of good reviews and a small Canada Council grant to tour across the country and actually get to know Canadian theatre a bit. By the way, all the reviews at the Half Moon were not all great. I remember one, I did a show about Ripper, just called Ripper, and Robert Cushman, who is at the time, he was the critic for the Observer. He then came to Canada and is now the emeritus critic for the National Post. A very, very good writer. Anyway, the title of his review, not favorable one, was called Unsprung Jack in the Observer. Of course, I didn't really care who did it. To me, the real Ripper was 19th century capitalism, and that was the point of the play, was that it wasn't an individual, it was capitalism itself that was killing all the women, the sex workers in and around, and that's why we partially did it, is because it just all of the Ripper murders happened right around the Half Moon. By the way, if anybody does want to track down the Half Moon a bit more in terms of what it is and what I did, they do. If you just go Google Half Moon in the East End of London, the theatre, and they had a heritage project, and there's a very long series of videos, some of which are with me, about the beginning of the Half Moon and some. So all of the excitement that I told you about last time is all up there in greater detail on that website. I was very lucky. I've always been very lucky working with great designers. So the Ripper designer was a designer by Bill Dudley. He was my sort of go-to designer at the time at the Half Moon. He ended up as the major designer at the Royal Shakespeare Company years later. Just as back at the Toronto Free, Deborah Hanson was my kind of go-to designer. She ended up actually the head of design at the Stratford Festival here. So as I've always been very fortunate with the designers that I've got to work with. So I come back to Canada and I'm just in the middle of that spiraling, bubbling naissance of an English Canadian theatre. Of course, in Quebec, in 1968, Michel Tremblay, Les Belles Sœurs, had totally changed Quebec theatre, and suddenly, Quebec stories were a heck of a lot better than Racine and some classical French accent up on the stage. So that happened in Quebec long before it happened in English Canada. When I got back, things were just really starting to percolate. I mentioned that when I got home to Montreal, I saw On the Job, and it, I mean, there were cheers when the mention of familiar streets or something in Montreal in the audience. That's how starved we were for our own stories. I also, in rural Ontario, caught the Farm Show, Theatre Passe-Muraille. Paul Thompson, they had spent, the company had spent sort of some time in Perth County, meeting the local farming community, absorbing stories, and they came up with this really entertaining, quite character-rich, fascinating collective about farm life in rural Ontario. Actors like Ted Johns, Janet Amos, Anne Anglin, Eric Peterson were all part of it. I can still remember, even I guess it's 45 years later, I can still see Eric Peterson walking on the stage in Pretoria down in Ontario, Ontario, being a doddering old farmer. Eric Peterson, of course, ended up as in the Remount of the Seeds, the Port Parole company here in Montreal just a few years ago, and then a couple of other shows working with Port Parole. He also, and I'm about to get to that, he also played Howie Morenz in my production of Les Canadiens at the Centaur. Also, I went to the Blythe Festival, and I guess just to remind you the story there, this is just to illustrate how Canadian theatre was bubbling. The founders of the Blythe Festival in their first season did 2 shows. They did Agatha Christie's Mousetrap because they thought they would have to sell tickets, and then they did a show that they wanted to do, which is an adaptation of Alice Munro story, How I Met My Husband. And of course, it was the Alice Munro story that sold out, and nobody wanted to see the Mousetrap. And after that, Blythe Festival became the Canadian festival of new Canadian plays. And in fact, I ended up in a few years directing there as well. I got to Calgary. Oh, and the Donnelly trilogy. Keith's his NDWT, Keith Turnbull, his NDWT company was another one of the shows I saw that totally mesmerized me, just because this was us being reflected on the stage as I saw it at the time. I got to Calgary. Thanks, I'd met Bill Glasgow, who was running the Tarragon, the home of the Canadian playwright. And he sent me to meet W.O. Mitchell, and I met him. He liked me, and I ended up directing the world premiere of Back to Beulah. A great story, 4 great parts for female actors. 3 emotionally challenged women in a halfway house end up kidnapping their psychiatrist and have to be sent back to Beulah, to the institution. It was a hit. Again, I told you that Theatre Calgary at the time was doing a lot of schlock, American sort of Broadway stuff, 2 for the Seesaw, and I don't know what. And they were told by the Canada Council, you better do some Canadian stuff or else, your grants are going to suffer. So grudgingly, they sought out W.O. Mitchell and asked him if he had a play, and he suggested Back to Beulah. When it was the script was handed to me, the artistic directors of Theatre Calgary said, it's going to dump. Nobody likes W.O. This is going to be a terrible, it'll not sell any tickets, but we got to do it because the Canada Council says we got to do it. And in actual fact, of course, it was the hit of the season. In fact, it then toured to the Tarragon, played for a couple of weeks there, did reasonably well there, not boffo, but it gave me a credibility. So I had my first play under my belt with some decent credibility. And the thing about being a freelance director in this country is you've got to get about 2 or 3 separate hits in order to get up into that higher echelon where suddenly any theater in the country will hire you, even if they don't know you, just because you've had a few hits. So I started racking them up, Beulah being the first one. Back in Montreal, I had a meeting with Morris. I had known Morris before I left. And of course, as I think I mentioned, I had hired Elsa in my first theater company. And I pitched him, he was watching a baseball game, and I pitched him a show about Les Canadiens. It was meant to be a kind of a metaphor for history, a way of mirroring the history of Quebec through the history of the Les Canadiens and hockey in Quebec. So he sort of nodded, said, it's a good idea, and go and find a writer. So I went out and hired Rick Salutin as a writer on the project. He'd worked with Passamarais on their 1837, the Farmers' Revolt, and he had politically and seemed the right guy for the task. So I'm starting to prepare to direct for Les Canadiens in the 76-77 season and center, and then I get my, I guess, real break. After On the Job, David Fenario's first play, his first big hit, David and the other David Calderisi, who had directed the show, had a falling out. So Morris suggests me to David Fenario, and I get to direct Nothing to Lose, David's second play, an all-male cast set in a tavern opposite a shipping factory. And the question is to strike or not to strike. A little bit biographical. There's a David Fenario character, writer character in there, and he's sort of a little, bit the hero because he persuades the workers, both the French and the English, to go out on strike. But the characters, that was David's strength, and the dialogue, right? And he gave actors genuine people to play, and we had this realistic set. I don't know if what you can see here. This is from the original production. There's Peter McNeill, and in the back there he is right there, is Jean Archambault Chibougamau. He kept saying, "This is the place, this is not the place." Jean, you'll forgive me, I'm not making fun of you. Jean became a very dear friend. He died of cancer a few years back. And Peter McNeill is still a buddy, and both of them, of course, were the stars of Falconville, which is to come. So the politics for me were a little naive. I mean, I'd been hanging around with Trotskyites of the Fourth International, but I never doubted David's genuine belief in what he was writing. And the actors had something to play, and it was the hit of 76. The Gazette called it, the play, the best production of the year, blah blah blah. So now I had another hit under my thing. In fact, Nothing to Lose then was brought back, and then it went on a tour of Ontario, played in Toronto. What I'm trying to just outline here is the bubbling energy, that a wave of energy of new play that I was, being the right guy in the right place, able to surf on. The play where Canadian audiences wanted new plays, new Canadian plays. And of course I had adored working with Jean, adored working with Peter McNeill. And then I get to go back to, and now I'm directing Les Canadiens. And Morris had a connection to Ken Dryden, and so he was asked if he would support Rick Salutin in writing, and Ken agreed. And the research, of course, for me was a gas. I mean, I've been a lifelong Canadien fan. I should actually have my cap here. So I got to meet Dickie Moore and Jean Beliveau and all of that at the time. Those were the beginnings of, right, 76, 77. If you know your Les Canadiens history, it was the beginning of a dynasty. Guy Lafleur, Robinson, Ken Dryden in goal, Guy Lapointe, and so on. It was, and at the time, you, in the old forum, you could, I bought, I was getting a huge amount of money, so I would buy a standing room ticket, right? For $8, you could buy a standing room ticket. Now, Montreal always skated towards the south in the first period. So in the first period, I'd be a standing ticket overlooking the opponent's goal, and you watch the whole play come towards you, and made the play Robinson to Lafleur, slap shot, and so on. And then in the intermission, you walk around, and you're now in the north end of the arena, and they're attacking. So you had, for $8, as far as I'm concerned, I had the best seats in the house. The next season, it was actually $10 for a standing ticket. So those were the days. And Les Canadiens, of course, Bob Gainey was there on opening nights making fun. There was a scene that made fun of money and wives with fur coats, and he's there with his wife who died tragically early, and he's making fun of her fur coat because there she is standing in the lobby on opening night with her fur coat. Anyway, it was a dream come true. It was not a huge hit. It was respectable, but not a huge hit. Just so that it's to outline that life in theater is not necessarily always rosy. Rick Salutin and I ultimately did not see eye to eye. In an interview with Le Devoir just before opening, he admitted that the script had been completed with the assistance of the cast, Reed also with the director. But after the run, Rick sold the play to Toronto Workshop Production, and even got them to import the 3 Francophone actors from my cast and the designer, Astrid Jansen, fabulous designer, and so on. So I felt a little bit, a little ripped off. And Rick wasn't even a Habs fan. But anyway, he is a great writer, Rick. If any of you read his columns in the Globe and Mail, or now in the Toronto Star, I admire his journalism. I mean, he's the conscience. He was the conscience, the left-wing conscience of the Globe and Mail, the national newspaper. And now he's doing the same for the Star. Usually his astute, succinct observations but he's not a playwright, and he never will be a playwright. In any case, I didn't give a shit because I already was on to other projects. There was one of the great scenes in Les Canadiens was came from a story that Ken Dryden told. The players, it's 76, November 15th, 1976. And if you remember what happened, the PQ government, the PQ gets elected as a government for the first time. So normally where you have in the forum, you had the scores, out of town scores, Toronto 0 and Chicago 5 or something. They were showing the election results. So here are the Montreal Canadiens skaters skating away, trying to play a game of hockey. The entire forum doesn't give a shit. They're just watching the results of the PQ victory, the number of seats being elected on the it wasn't the jumbotron then, but on the electronic displays. So there were some good scenes in there. And as I say, Eric Peterson was in it, and a bunch of other nice actors. Michael Rudder was in it, and so on. So now, because of Nothing to Lose being a decent production, now Douglas Rain invites me to work at the theater school. Douglas, if you remember, he was Hal, the voice of the computer in 2001. He basically was headhunted. The school was in the shambles, a little bit like it is now, and he was headhunted to go in, given a 3-year contract, go in, clean it up. And he was old school, right? He did not allow anybody to call him Douglas. All the students had to call him Mr. Rain. But he upped the quality of that school. That's the generation that came out. Shauna McKenna, Colin Fjord, Joe Ziegler, Brian Dooley, Ron Lee, Kate Trotter. In those 3 years, in his intake and his teaching, he also, what he did was, he only let older actors in. He only invited you if you'd already had a bit of a life. So the teaching, the craft stuck with you and made an impression. And I think, I don't think the school, he was not that popular always. I respected him. I think he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But he also, I think, was loved and respected too by those that understood what he was trying to do. You have to call him Mr. Rain all through school, and then on graduation day, as he comes up and gives you your diploma, he leans into you. You can call me Douglas now. Anyway, Douglas Rain, what an amazing man. So I was very lucky. I had a couple of years where I was working and doing some stuff with the theater school and really enjoying it. So I also at the time, and of course, not allowed these days, but I fell in love with one of the students. And we ended up a couple of years later getting married, having a wonderful daughter together. In fact, some of those relationships between teachers and students, I mean, we all know Joel Miller and Diana Feyerabend. They are one of the model couples in our Montreal theater world. And he was running the school and she was a student. And in those days, that still happened. Nowadays, you'd get cashiered out of the school if you did that. The school. All right, I'm going to pass on dissing the school at the moment. It's just become a business. I don't understand why they don't just stick to teaching actors how to act. By the way, if you remember, I also said that I really believed in a kind of the medieval craft system. So in London, I called those my wandering apprenticeship years. And now I allowed myself, when I came back, to call myself a journeyman. In '86, I directed a production of Hamlet with R.H. Thompson. And for me, that was when I then also permitted myself the status of being a master. That's just an indication of, as I say, I think that when we look at our craft, we should look at some of those old style designations and teaching gradations. So the other thing then in 78, 79, I get invited to Saskatoon to do the provincial and then the national tour of Paperweed. And I think I mentioned last time how blind we were that we created, that we did a collective creation about the immigrants and the opening up of the West. And we never once talked about the broken treaties. We never once talked about the First Nations. We just were in 78, 79, absolutely blind to that reality, to our shame. However, I do not want to take away from the fact that those initial immigrants, most of them were refugees from Europe. They came with nothing, and they had the sweat of their hands and the plow and the horses. They actually tilled the soil and created their farms and fed their families and fed us in the East as well. And that whole cooperative movement, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool and the co-ops and so on, that is one of the core values, I believe, that's inherent in Canada. I mean, if that cooperative movement that Paperweed was celebrating, the battle against Cargill, the battle against money, the battle against the big farms, the battle to struggle to work together to survive, that ends up as Medicare, right, in the 60s and Tommy Douglas. That's the evolution of that particular story. Again, Paperweed, another lovely success. There's actually, the NFB did a documentary of it. So if you go to the NFB, you can see that. You can see a bunch of 70s hippies trying to do left-wing theater. And the CBC then did a transcript of it as well. So they used to trot it out on Canada Day every year. I probably, they will never trot it out again for exactly the reasons that I'm explaining about the blindness. So that was Paperweed. I mean, if you had witnessed, and the National Film Board documentary captures some of those moments, the electricity between the Legion Hall or a small school in Bigger, Saskatchewan, absolutely packed, farming families, all generations, watching, laughing, crying to what they're experiencing on stage, the most basic of Brechtian props and backdrops and so on, that defines real theater. That's, to me, is, that electricity between the stage and the house is what we strive for. And things like the farm show, things like Paperweed, absolutely were able to define theater. And again, I point out that I was just lucky. I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time when our audiences were hungry for that experience. Where are we going to go today, tomorrow, with smartphones and Zooming, and I have no idea. I have no idea where theater can get back to that kind of primal electricity. But that's what we all strive for. I would come back as a freelance director at the time. I would come back to my apartment on Hutchison, the plateau side of Hutchison, not the Outremont side, a 7.5 top floor. The rent was $110 heated. Okay. The time that I was away, the floor would dry up. So my first thing I would do is just walk through every room, crack the floor again, listening to the McGarrigle sisters. That was my coming home ritual. Now we get to Falconville. So Les Canadiens, actually, I insisted that it have some French in it. I could not imagine the character Raymond Bellil, who was playing the Rocket. I couldn't imagine him speaking English. So he had his monologues in French. And then at one point I get back, I was not invited to direct David Fenario's third play. David and I, we have a way of butting heads in rehearsal with respect. But he decided he wanted another director. So his third play, called Toronto, it was actually about our rehearsals for, not rehearsals, our auditions in Toronto for Nothing to Lose. It didn't go very well. So, hey, Morris hands me this script called Falconville. Again, I think he was watching baseball or something, and he just sort of hands, it's not his best play, but I guess we got to do it. Morris will deny that, and Morris and I have had our ins and outs, but that's exactly what happened. So I read it. I'm not sure what I thought, whether it was good or not. I don't think anybody knew what we had in our hands. We found a couple of additions to the thing. Somehow or other, a French actor by the name of Marc Zeldina came in to audition for Parquet. He was a well-known figure, in fact, a bit of a vedette in French Quebec as a singer. He'd hit a few skids. He just liked his bottle. And I think he was coming to us as a way to resurrect his career or something like that. Of course, David wrote Thibault for Jean, and Peter McNeil, who grew up in Verdun, is very much, a product of David Fenario country. Played the lead. Terry Tweed was in it. Played the downstairs single mom, and so on. So we were rehearsing Falconville. About the third day, there's a scene between Paquette and his daughter, and they're talking in English, and I'm going, no, what's going on here? It doesn't make sense. So I told the actors, go home and just translate the dialogue, and which is what they did, and that's how. And admittedly, I should have communicated with David a bit better. But he came in one day and they were speaking French. He said, "Hey, what's going on?" But it was clearly the right decision, and it stuck. And that was one of the selling points of the whole thing. Marc Zeldina, by the way, it was one day in rehearsal. We're now going into the winter. It opened in January '79. He was, as I say, a vedette. So there was one day after rehearsal where late at night, I think it was, we get out, it's a snowstorm. His car won't start. It's just parked quite near the Centaur. And as he's trying to start it, a taxi goes by, recognizes him, Monsieur Zeldina. So the taxi driver gets out and is just, thrilled to bits that he's dealing with Marc Zeldina. So he boosts the car and wipes down the snow. And in the meantime, while he's doing that, another taxi pulls up and says, "Oh, Monsieur Zeldina, est-ce que je peux vous aider? Qu'est-ce qu'il y a?" So the two of them start the car, and Marc lived across the river at the time. So, and the two taxi drivers are totally thrilled. Having boosted him, they kind of convoy him across the river. So one in front, one back, and they make sure that he gets home across the bridge. Anyway, that's what it's like being a vedette in French Quebec. Unfortunately, I don't think we have that necessarily. Well, maybe Sugar Sammy or somebody might get that kind of reaction. I don't know, but not our actors. It was, as I suspect you all know, it's a very simple work that tells of a group of people living in working class Verdun, Point St. Charles, and they fight a lot, and then of course they come together at the end because there's a fire and they support each other. David, once again, I can't say, and I've worked with a lot of writers, right? I've worked with on a lot of new plays. David has like a perfect pitch in his ear. He would sit there, you know, with the dialogue that he'd written, and an actor would be rehearsing, and an actor would say the line, I don't know, good morning. And he would hear that that was not sitting in the actor. It was not going into their being. He would rewrite the line, give it back to them. And that way, that's how the actors, he helped them get it into their swamp, as we acting teachers would say, get the dialogue, get the lines, get the character inside their irrational beings. And of course, you know, he was changing the lines all the time. And if you ask Peter MacNeill, even on the first preview, there's David just before Peter MacNeill has got to go on, handing him new lines, right? Hey, so it was very frustrating, but it clearly it worked. I must have done a few things right because we brought it back for a second run. We played it in Toronto. It won all the sort of theater prizes in Toronto. Played it in Winnipeg, and it toured. It toured to London, to Bath, and to Ireland. I was gratified because a couple of the reviews in London said, "Hey, welcome back to Guy Sprung, who's toiled so hard in the East End of London on Half Moon." So that was a nice welcome back for me. And of course, I don't have the poster for Falconville at the Royal Belfast Opera House, the Grand. It had been bombed. And they had just refurbished it, rebuilt it back up in the Troubles, as part of the Troubles. And they had brought in this Canadian play that showed the Catholic and the Protestant working class getting on together. It was a very deliberate choice for the reopening of the Grand Opera House in Belfast. And if you remember in Falconville, if you saw it, you know that Thibault at one point has the line, "Fuck the Queen." And it was so funny watching Jean Archambault rolling through the whole play. The thing is going really well. And then suddenly, just before he gets to that line in Protestant Belfast, in the brand new opera house, he's going, and he realizes what he's about to say, and he just swallows the word. So that was touring Falconville in Belfast. Even the swearing was a bit too much. I think we counted 56 F words that Peter MacNeill's character had, and I think they diminished a little bit in Winnipeg, and certainly also in the Grand Opera House as well. And I've for all of the tension that David and I have, it's always been about work, right? And it's David walks the walk. That's the bottom line, and he continues to do so. And when I came back to Montreal to run the Infinite, then we still twice hooked up together, Banana Boots, and then Bolsheviki, when he could no longer perform his one-man shows, and Bob King played essentially David Finario and Bolsheviki, which we then we took it to Stratford as well, and so on. It had a good and healthy run at Infinite Theatre. But at the same time, as I was doing this, I'm also starting to do way too much, right? There was a moment when Falconville finished up running 3 weeks in the Théâtre Maisonneuve at Place des Arts. Anyway, David was picketing out front while his play was going on because he was supporting the ushers who were on strike. At one point, I had so many productions lined up that I was directing that I had a 12-hour day, that's a tech day in theater parlance, putting Falconville into Place des Arts, different theater. You have to do the lighting again. You have to adjust the set and so on. And at the same time, I had a 12-hour day at the theater school, directing an adaptation of Desmond of Desmond Morris's Man Watching. So well, I can remember what happened. So I leave the one theater, I go to the other, I work another 6-7 hours, and at some point, my brain just says, sorry, we're out of here. I can't see. I've gone blind because I'm just overworking. That's of course, I had to fake it, right? I could not let on to any of the technicians in the room or anything what was going on. So I just kept, giving notes, and eventually my sight came back. But that's how crazy those days were as a freelance. One of the other things we did, I can remember, we did Sam Shepard's Unseen Hand with the students. It was a small class. Colin Furr was in it. And I can still hear Colin Furr singing some of Sam Shepard's lines to Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze, and so on. I better jump forward here very quickly. Jesus Christ, this takes so long. I'm so sorry. So another one of the bigger, surprises, nice surprise, was another W.O. Mitchell that got hired. We did it at Black Bonspiel of Willie McCrimmon, and it basically came back a couple of times, toured Alberta as part of the 75th anniversary of Alberta becoming a province. It bankrolled Theatre Calgary into their new venue for years. Anyway, it was heady days for Canadian theatre, heady days for me. And I think at one point, Falconville too was picked up for TV. My good friend Marc Blanfort directed it, and somewhere out there's some DVDs of Falconville. I've never actually seen it, but it was on CBC and so on. So why does this happen that way? Why was Canadian theatre? I remember a statistic. Playwrights Canada came out in the mid-'80s with a statistic that mid-80% of all plays being presented in Canada were Canadian. Now, that's a statistic that German theater or British theater or American theater could never have boasted of. But that's the way things were happening in Canada at the time. I don't know. So then I'm headhunted to run the Toronto Free. And I moved to Toronto. Toronto Free Theatre was in one of it was one of the four major independent theatre companies in Toronto. So you had the Factory, you had the Pterodon, you had Passe Muraille, and you had Toronto Free. And it had done some really good work. When I was headhunted, it had hit hard times, doing a little bit things that were a little too fringy, a little too off. They'd lost their audience. Total box office in the year before I took over was 65,000. So it was Tom Hendry, a very, very good man. He co-founded the Manitoba Theatre Centre. He personally headhunted me, and finally I actually had a theatre that I hadn't founded, and relatively real budgets, two wonderful spaces to program, and I was let loose. I've forgotten all the things that we programmed, but we worked with Necessary Angel, other theaters. It was just crazy the amount of work that we did. Not all the shows were new or invented. Sometimes I borrowed production. There was a production of Trafford Tansey that the National Arts Centre did, and Instinct said, this is going to sell. We ran it as part of our season. At one point, it was a big hit. We brought it back, and then we actually raised the financing and had it as a commercial production. Trafford Tansey is a show set in a boxing ring. Martha Burns played the lead. She was Trafford. The actors have to learn how to wrestle. They have to learn how to fake the falls, fake the hurt, fake the everything. It's a huge physical show. But you can imagine audience on four sides with actors playing a play, and there's also musical. It was a musical too, although it was not original music. They were borrowed songs, but and it worked, and it just worked. And so, yeah, we did a commercial production of it. David Black, who was the president of Toronto Free at the time, he got his friends together. Everybody put in a certain amount of money, bought shares, and that was at the end of the second year of running Toronto Free. And so within 2 years, the box office had gone from 65,000 to $1 million, over $1 million. There were other things that I did, which I'll get to in a second, but I was also still freelancing, did a show called Quiet in the Land and Chislet's show. It's an anti-war show set during the First World War in an old Order Amish community. It was David Fox played the father, Keith Thomas played the son. It was, again, just one of those wonderful pieces of writing. It went on to win a Governor General's Award. When I see Jamie Portman, who was a longtime critic, one of the major national critics in Canada, he still talks about the moment when Keith Thomas let Kate Trotter's hair down as being one of the most magical moments he'd ever seen in theater. It worked, and even some of the old Order Amish in Blythe came and snuck in. It was one of the plays I brought to Toronto as part of our season. I redid Jungle of the Cities, the show that I opened the Half Moon with Paul Gross playing the lead. It was with scaffolding and trampolines and another sort of boxing ring. It was a wild and crazy show. In fact, I remember the Canada Council officer on opening night sitting there glued to her seat after she had seen the show, just shaking her head and saying, nothing like this has ever been seen in English theater in Canada before. And that's how crazy those times were. I had a fabulous GM and a great production manager, and we felt we could do anything. And we had a week of previews. That's how much we wanted the shows to really be nailed. So we did a week of previews, but we had no problem selling the place out on subscription, including the previews. In fact, at that time, theater, the Toronto Free, if you were a lawyer or a dentist or something, and you wanted to have something to talk about, you came to the Toronto Free, you bought tickets, because that was the wave of where the action was. And it's an interesting thing that movie, TV, that there's money to be made in those genres. There's no real money to be made in theater, maybe in musicals and emerges. But so the Americans don't care. They didn't want to take over our theater. It was our home product. And that's why it was, I think, so central to Canadian culture, because unlike our movies or our movie screens or even TV, there's not enough money to be made for the Americans to give a shit about. And that's why we got on with doing our own thing. Eddie Gilbert did a very credible production of Merchant of Venice. He was running Center Stage, which was the big regional theater just down the road from the Free. And we started talking about the concept of merging. And I did a John Morel play, Memoir, with Monique Mercure and Jean Archabot, brought him from Montreal. Quiet in the Land, as I say. And because Quiet worked in Blythe, and Blythe is just 40 minutes from Stratford, John Hirsch, who was the artistic director in Stratford, saw it and liked what I'd done and offered me translations in the Avon Theatre the next summer. And that was another lucky break for me. And I wanted an all-Canadian cast. There were a lot of good Irish expats who work in Canadian theatre, but I wanted us to come up with our own sense of being Irish. So I only cast Canadian actors working as if they were Irish. It's translations, it was, I think the Centaur did it as well. It's Brian Friel, and it's a play that that captures the moment in Irish history, in the early 19th century, when the British engineers were covering Ireland with teams who were renaming all of the Celtic names, place names, and giving them British names. It was a way, it's sort of what we, the settlers, have done to the First Nations as well. We take away the heritage by changing the names. And that's what the British Army was doing. So this was a love story that happened in a small village. And it was really about the loss of identity of Ireland. And Brian Friel, of course, has written a lot of plays. He's a wonderful man. A couple of years later, on the third birthday of my eldest daughter, we were holidaying in Ireland, and Brian Friel, I'd spoken to him on the phone, and I knew he lived just across in Muff, just across from Derry in Donegal. It was part of the Republic of Ireland, but it was just across the border from Northern Ireland. So I said, let's go visit him. So I just drove up to Muff, knowing only that he lived there, stopped in the middle of the street, got out, and asked the first person who came by. And I said, excuse me, we're looking for Brian Friel's home. Do you know where he lives? And this person looked at me skeptically. He said, Brian Friel, eh? Brian Friel. Ah, yes. So you think he can write plays then? And I'm a Behan man myself. Referring to Brendan Behan. So right there and then, he wasn't going to give me the address, but he did want to have a lively discussion about the virtues of Irish playwrights and who was better, Brendan Behan or Brian Friel. Anyway, in the end, he did give me the address. We knocked on the door of Brian's home, which was right on the water. He was a funny little, lovely man. Invites us in, we stay overnight, had a long night of drinking and arguing and so on. But that's Brian Friel, and that's translations, which I mention here, I did for the Stratford Festival, but John Hirsch had the class to let us take the set, and we did the production at the Toronto Free as well as part of the season. And of course, once again, it did very nicely. Miles Potter, Kate Trotter, Jim Mizon, Don Lewis, Biff McGuire. Great cast. I'm going to jump here because I'm running out of time, and I want to get to the hijacking, which I know is the juicy bits. So I mentioned Hamlet. I'd worked with RH a couple of times. He came to me and said, Guy, I'd like to play Hamlet. So we started working together on a production of Hamlet. And we worked on our own for a bit. I cut it down to a certain extent, and I set it in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, sort of at the time when the German emperor had basically defeated France. It was set in the court of the German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm, and that was the images that we used, and that was partially because at the Toronto Free, the windows had the roundness and exact shape that the mirrors have in Versailles. So I don't know why. It just made sense. And Deborah Hansen did these incredible costumes. I don't know if what you can see here. This is the last moment of that particular production, RH Dead, and the entire court around him, and Deborah's wonderful costumes. Again, I'm sorry. It doesn't give you a proper viewpoint of it. RH was a great Hamlet because Hamlet's a thinker, and he always found the shadows. He was always he didn't know, should I or should I not pick up this action? Should I act or should I act? And that's really the central pun of Hamlet. And I won't bore you with my analysis of the play. Claudius means to have a limp. So in my version, Claudius the king has got to have a limp. It's an image of the devil. And it's very much a discussion, not just Hamlet's speech to the players, but the whole thing is a discussion about how does an actor become the character they're portraying. It's a most incredibly subtle dissertation on the very nature of acting, as in on a stage, and acting as in taking an action, in this case, revenging your father's murder. At the very end, Fortinbras says of the dead body of Hamlet, he says, take him to the stage. Now, that's the talk of the palace. Of course, it's a dual meaning, but it is a dual meaning. Now that actor is ready to act the part because he has found his way into it. Even when, for instance, Claudius is praying and he's trying to ask God for forgiveness for the sin of fratricide. At the end, he gets up and he says, basically says, I can't pray because words without thoughts will not to heaven go. That's his line. And that's what that means. Two things. It also means that if an actor does not have the proper thought, then his words will not get to the heavens, which was the canopy over the Globe Theatre. The heavens were right there. So you won't get to the back row as an actor unless you have the right thoughts. Anyway, that I won't bore you with more of that kind of full academe dissecting of Shakespeare, but I love doing that. Anyway, it ran for 11 weeks, and RH is a thinker, and he's also a very, very moral man, and that's what Hamlet is. I've seen productions recently at Stratford and so on where it's all about Hamlet's got to be the Juve lead, the Hollywood young man. No. I mean, there was one production of Hamlet where the big scene was Hamlet crawling up these boxes in order to get to the ghost, and he was like some He-Man. That's not what the play is about. The play is about a man who doesn't have the courage to do an action unless he thinks morally it's the right thing to do. Anyway, it's our predicament. So we did Waiting for Godot with Donald Davis. We did Sam Shepard's Fool for Love. I did a really innovative production in the Toronto Planetarium, a musical written by Paul Gross called Thunder Perfect Mind. It's 86. The first musical, we used the Star Machine, we used all the projectors, we used it was a crazy vision. It didn't totally work. It did run for 11 weeks, but it didn't really work. It wasn't a great piece of art, but it was a great attempt. We had bits of film coming in. We had at the very first cue, and it was all cued by the planetarian computer, right? He had to program 750 cues in the first 30 seconds of the show. That's how complicated it was. And the planetarium let us in because, as we know, planetariums were running out of steam. The best before date of planetariums had arrived, and they were looking for other ways to get people into the planetarium. And that's why it didn't work really, although as I say, it did run for 11 weeks, but not sold out. I also did the first AIDS play in Toronto, as is, in co-production with the Shaw Festival. Christopher Newton approached me. He wanted to do the play, but he was afraid to risk it at the Shaw Festival. So we co-produced it at the Toronto Free. I did get some very nice feedback from the gay community for putting it on. I mean, can you imagine that at some time in the mid-'80s, it was still considered risky to put on a gay play about AIDS in Toronto? Thank God those days are gone. One other thing that happened during this time, before I get to, was I did Death of a Salesman in Stratford. So it was, Hirsch was very good to me. He said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to do Death of a Salesman, because Arthur Miller was a hero of mine for his stance at the House of Un-American Activities. He refused to name names. So I had this boyhood kind of hero worship. So I want to do Death of a Salesman. And I thought it was very much a Jewish story. So I headhunted an American actor by the name of Nehemiah Persoff, Nicky. He had been in On the Waterfront. He was an Israeli actor who had come to New York. And had a bit of a name. And Ming Cho Lee, who'd won many awards in the States, did the design. Kim Hunter played the wife. She won the Oscar for Streetcar Named Desire. It was the 17th show to open that season, which meant that all of our technology was pushed back. I had this crazy dream that the whole play was a dream, and I wanted the furniture to slip on stage with this magically in the middle of Willie's nightmare, as it were. And of course, because we were the 17th show, they hadn't worked out all of the technology, so we actually had a dress rehearsal before we had our tech rehearsal. Anyway, that's another story. But Arthur Miller had just done a production of Death of a Salesman in Beijing, and he came to visit on the dress rehearsal. There's always the ritual at Stratford is that there's a dress rehearsal in front of the company, and anybody can come. It's in the Avon's Theater, so about 600 people. So there it was. I was going to have supper with my hero, Arthur Miller, and then he was going to watch the dress rehearsal because the next day he had one of those forum speeches that he was giving. Now, just a quick side thing. So the problem with Nicky, he couldn't remember his lines. It was a serious issue with him. And luckily, I cast Michael Hogan and Booth Savage as the two sons. And they are such sweethearts as human beings that they basically, all through rehearsal, they just sat there and they waited for him to drop his lines, and they would feed him his cue or take turns feeding his cue. It was a beautiful sight to behold. Two actors supporting this elder actor. And Nicky had a rep, right? He had a back story with Arthur Miller, because Arthur had dated Nicky's Nicky's sister. And then because Nicky was becoming a star, at one point, Arthur Miller hands View from the Bridge, the script to him over, and Nicky thinks he's being offered the lead. And when he's only offered one of the gangsters in the play, he turns it down. So they had this 30 years ago, they'd had this kind of tiff before. Now, Miller's going to come and see Nicky play Willie. Wow, Willie Loman. I have supper. In walks Arthur Miller. Of course, I'm like this, right? And the first thing he says is, Death of a Salesman in Beijing was the greatest event in the history of Chinese theater. And there went right there the scales from my eyes. He was not a nice person, Arthur, as much as he was a great playwright. So that kind of, I didn't know how to pick up the conversation, and the supper was not necessarily the most entertaining for either of us. So now he goes to the dress rehearsal, and he waits to the very last minute. The house lights are going down, walks down the aisle, 600 other people. Everybody knows who he is. He walks to the front row, into the center, sits down, folds his arms, leans back, lights up, and there's Nicky up on stage, his opening monologue. He walks on stage, he clocks Arthur Miller in the front row, and he can't get another line out. Again, luckily, Booth and Michael save him to a certain extent. But it was that in conjunction with all the technical difficulties that we were still having, it was a tough night in the theater. Afterwards, Nicky's in his dressing room and he's distraught, right? He's absolutely he's in tears. Door opens. There's Arthur. Nicky pretends, oh, Arthur, I didn't know you were in the house. Silence. Nicky, but Arthur, I screwed up some of your great lines. Miller, you did. Silence. Nicky, but don't worry, Arthur, don't worry, I'll get them all right by opening night. Miller, do that, turns and goes, leaving an actor totally destroyed. Anyway, that's my Arthur Miller story, and he's no longer a hero of mine, as you can imagine. What's interesting is, of course, Dustin Hoffman was in preparation to do the show, a remount on Broadway, and Miller sent Dustin up, and he snuck in and saw a matinee of the show. Anyway, years later, I'm at an opening night at Stratford, and a technician comes up and says to me, "Guy, you don't know me. I'm so and so. I was a technician at the Avon Theatre when you were directing Death of a Salesman, and I remember distinctly one day you were on stage directing the actors. I'm up in the fly gallery, trying to, listening, waiting for the next cue. And I just broke down in tears." He says it was just such an amazing event. And the show itself, the father-son stuff, gets people in that story very much. Anyway, two things I left a legacy for the Toronto Free. One of them was the Dream in Hyde Park. So in the spring of '83, I'm walking through Hyde Park. I want to do Dream in Hyde Park, and I want to do it outdoors. And so take 2 days, I walk through the park, and I find the perfect location for an outdoor amphitheater. I was supported in this by Andrei Tarasiuk. He was my project manager, and the only reason why this ever happened was because Herb Perk was then the head of the Parks Department, the commissioner, and he got in on the project like that. He said, you've got it. Now, today you couldn't do what we did. Within 6 months of conceiving it, we found the location. We got the city on side. We got a cast. We got a design. We got generators. We got PCM mics. We rehearsed the show outdoors, right at the feet of 2 oak trees that acted as a kind of 100-year-old oak trees that were a kind of acted as a kind of proscenium, a sloping grass incline towards this proscenium. In the first 2 years, we were allowed to actually have actors in the trees. So, Puck was rappelling out of the trees, etc. And Oberon gave some of the speeches from the trees, etc. It was one of those crazy ideas that I had that somehow, with the technicians, with Leighton Morris, the production manager, and so on, we pulled off. I don't know how we did it. We rehearsed, we got out there, and it was the day after Canada Day. We had a radio advertising station advertising it. We had no idea if anybody would even come, if anybody had heard about it. So on opening night, by 5, people were coming. At 6, the hill was pretty much packed. By 7, there was people still coming in. By 8, they were going all around. They surrounded. There must have been 2,500 people on that opening night. The actors had to step around actors to get from the trees onto the stage. And that was the beginning of what is still what's a major summer theater event in Toronto. I actually read somewhere that after 40 years, they reckon that's probably 2 million people have seen Shakespeare outdoors. And of course, I was trying to bring theater to the people. There's my left-wing mania again for cheap, and it sure worked. So it was just by donation, and every night was a zoo, and people brought their wine, and they brought their picnic baskets, and they brought the families, and the babies were asleep, and it was a really good show. John Mills Cockle did the music, and that's part of the energy of the show, was his inventive music, which he played live every night. Right, he had this symbiosis with the actors. By the way, he did music for Hamlet too. and The Changeling, which was another play RH starred in. He did the music for that. We had a great relationship. In those days, we could actually afford to hire a composer as our house composer, and we give him a salary every week, and he would be there. And the day working with John Mills was crazy because he had all of his equipment in rehearsal, and he'd watch the rehearsal all the time, and he'd be pounding away with the sound off, but he'd be watching the actors and playing his music. And all you'd hear, would be his fingers on the keys. And then came the day when he flipped the switch and played the music that he had composed for us. And suddenly we were surrounded by this magic carpet that just lifted all of what we were doing on stage and made it, I don't know, just open your, that's what music does. It opens you and gets you ready for it. Same thing. So we did Dream for 2 years in a row, and then I directed Paul Gross and Kate Trotter in Romeo and Juliet. We nailed that play. There was a moment, I don't know how well you guys know the play. It's a comedy, the first half, up until when Mercutio is killed. It's a comedy. You're supposed to be laughing at those stupid young kids because they just fall in love like that. How silly can that be? And there's that one moment that Paul nailed so perfectly where he comes on initially, he's in love with Rosalind. And then when he sees Juliet, he goes, bingo, he says, wow, that's the real thing. And he turns to the audience and he says, wow, did I e'er love till now? And the whole 2,000 people on the hill cracked up. That's nailing Romeo and Juliet, when you can make fun of the kids, because what Shakespeare's doing, he's making you laugh. He's making you laugh and getting you defenseless. And then shoop, he puts the dagger in. Mercutio dies, and suddenly everything turns and it becomes this tragedy because you've fallen in love with the kids, even though they're stupid. But the point of the play that Shakespeare's saying is, whoa, love is not that. Love is classical, and it's considered, and it's slow. Anyway, we did Romeo and Juliet for 2 years as well, and then the fifth one, Comedy of Errors. But the nice thing about The Dream in Hyde Park was that it was I think it gave courage to all other outdoor Shakespeares across the country because it worked so well. I'm jumping because I'm not getting there. You can imagine. The other legacy that I've left besides that in true Toronto theatre was the campus of what was once the Toronto Free. So at one point, I'm going through City Hall because I'm talking to them about Dream in Hyde Park, and I walk into a room, and the architects are planning what to do with the building that we have rented from Greenspoon, the Wreckers, and they are deciding that they're going to build it into condos or something. And I happen to mistakenly walk into this room, and I explain to these guys, wait a second, no, there's a theater there. You can't do that. And they kind of looked at me, what, really? It's because of that. And then David Black interceded as well. In the end, the city gave us the entire campus for $1 a year, right? And I signed that first lease myself. And that's entirely because I caught them in time, persuaded them, because we had this relationship with the Dream in Hyde Park. The Toronto Free had credibility in the city. So when I said, hey, wait a second, we need that space. That's our theater. They said, oh, okay. So they reversed all of their plans and gave us the theater, which it's a complex, it's the most beautiful theater complex in Canada. It's got 2 performance spaces, courtyards, office room, tons of office room, rehearsal space, prop space, a shop, costume shop. It's got everything. There is even a parking lot that was big enough that I was planning to build a 600-seat theater on the parking lot. And we had hired the same architect who designed the Opera House in Toronto. And they came up with this incredible scheme. And I had this $5,000 model in my office of the potential new theater. So All of this is snowballing. You can imagine the hubris that this crazy director has. And what am I thinking? I'm thinking we can go bigger. We can do better. And so I admit that as the Toronto Free, I patented the phrase, the name, the National Theatre of Canada. We patented, my brother-in-law was a patent agent in Ottawa, he did it pro bono, but Toronto Free owned the National Theatre of Canada logo and name during that period, because that's ultimately what I thought we were heading towards. And then I talked to Bill Glasgow, and we started talking about merging his Centre Stage, the regional theatre, with Toronto Free, the alternate theatre. And so we did. And the initial plan was to be co-directors. He signed off on it. I think he was having enough. I think he basically discovered he didn't like directing for the Bloom Up Ball Theatre. I know Bill's strengths were subtlety, working one-on-one with actors and getting them confidence on small realistic plays. He was not someone who brought a big concept to a show and could fill a stage in a big way. I mean, I remember walking in on a rehearsal of his while we're in the middle of discussing. He was doing a restoration comedy. It was at the Bloom Appel Theatre, which is a 900-seat theatre. And he was trying to direct this restoration comedy. And he was fucking up. And it was a dress rehearsal. And I walk in just at the moment where Susan Wright, who was in one of the tours of Falconville, where she goes to the front of the stage and she screams, stops the show, and she screams to Bill Glasgow, "Are you gonna get up here and cut this piece of shit?" So that was gonna be my partner. And so we initially thought we could artistic directors. His board didn't see how that would work. So I came up with the concept that he would be the producing artistic director for 2 years, and then I would take over as the producing artistic director. For the name, we bandied that around a little bit. If you remember, the Royal Court in London, the English Stage Company, that was George Devine. That was one of my others, touchstones in terms of theatre history. So the Royal Court's run by the English Stage Company. So I plugged the name, the Canadian Stage Company, because that's what I thought. I thought that we were going to be, we were going to find the Osborns, we were going to find all of the great theatre that that the Divine found, Howard Brenton, Christopher Hampton, Carol Churchill, Timberlake Wurdenberger, and so on. I thought that's what the Canadian stage was going to be. We were going to be big enough so that we could put the resources behind significant Canadian writers, significant Canadian plays, to get them over the hump and into the consciousness, so that we would get out of the ghetto of the 200-seat theatre and we would bring Canadian theatre to 900 seats. That was the dream. And I just recently dug out, just by chance, most of my archives are in the National Library, but my plan for what's to be done, the artistic destination for the Canadian stage. It is the most jaw-dropping, wonderful vision for a big theater that would push our plays. I mean, what does it mean to be a national theater in Canada? I mean, how many countries do we have? We have Newfoundland, Nunavut. Geographically, there are 5 or 6 countries. We have Quebec, obviously its own nation. And we have over 600 First Nations. How do they fit in? What interest could a national theatre be to them? We have all of our cultural communities and diversity. I mean, it's the idea. You'll forgive me for my stupid hubris of thinking of that in the 80s, but there was this snowball that was happening, and I really thought that we could build a theater that would grab the best plays from Saskatchewan or Newfoundland and put them in front of a Toronto audience and sell tickets. I mean, the National Arts Centre is all very nice in Ottawa, but it doesn't have an audience, and Ottawa is a camping ground. It doesn't reflect Canada. At least Toronto has the diversity, the excitement that has in some way reflects where Canada is and where it's going. So that was the idea. And so we managed to sell this to our board, and Bill ran the first 2 seasons. I took a part-time sort of job in Vancouver, basically holding the fort of the Vancouver Playhouse for Larry Lillo, who's a director that I'd worked with at the Free and I really respected. And I held the fort for him, and then came back to Toronto once Bill had finished his first season and was planning my first season. I'm going to skip over here. I'm going to indulge you for another 10 minutes. Is that all right? I hope so, Donna. By the way, is that all right, Donna? Another 10 minutes?
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Bill and I didn't really see eye to eye. We were chalk and cheese, I think. But I supported him as his partner. I thought I ran interference with staff and tried best to help in the best possible way I could. He gave me a nice Russian play to direct, The Storm, Ostrovsky. I appreciated that. I did not do a good job. I was directing in Winnipeg at the same time. A show for the Mirvishes started in Winnipeg. I was doing way too much. I was nuts. And I should have stayed home. I should have prepared the future of Canadian stage properly. I should have had more people to talk to. Unfortunately, Peter Herndorf, we had headhunted him as the first president of Canadian stage. He and I never sat down and really chatted. It's a great shame. Things might have been different if we had. By the second season, he had left, was no longer the president of the board. I think if you check his CVs, I have a couple of times, he does never mentions that he was the president of Canadian Stage. The first one, I think he's embarrassed by what happened, and I don't blame him. He should be. He's done a lot for Canadian culture. What he did at the Arts Centre, for instance, he revived it in many ways. He's a man that I have a lot of respect for. He did not work. He did not do his job, I don't think, as president of the Can Stage. The first season that Bill ran had a deficit of nearly $1 million. His second season had a deficit of more than $500,000. So along I come. There's a lot of tension on the board. One of the things they wanted to do was cut the dream. I wouldn't let them. So already I had a lot of tension between me and the board because of that. Also, the board had some fairly heavy honchos on it. Remember, we're in the Brian Mulroney time. I had made fun of Brian Mulroney in a play in my first season about the Avro Arrow. Here's the set for it. At the time of the Avro Arrow, Brian Mulroney was an intern with Diefenbaker. We had Brian Mulroney as a character on stage and made fun of him. We had on the board the bagman for Ontario for the Conservative Party. So there were certain, as you can imagine, certain political question marks, I think, and there were some serious of the money people on the board who were very happy to get rid of me. So my first season actually did reasonably well. It had a deficit of about 450, but it was the smaller deficit so far, and I was looking forward, and we announced a season of all Canadian plays in February, March. And it had took a lot to negotiate this through the board. There was a lot of resistance. And then in the meantime, and I won't get time to have this, I was directing Shakespeare in Moscow. You can find this on any library at the moment. Hot Ice is my book that I wrote on directing Shakespeare in Moscow at exactly the same time. So I was partially out of a month of the time I was out of the country. And the board started basically conspiring with Bill's helping hand. And by the way, the season that I put together had things like Michael Hollingsworth's adaptation of Martin Chuzzlewit, the Dickens novel. It had a Margaret Atwood musical. It had a new musical from Paul Ledoux, and it had a play by Douglas Roger called How Could You, Mrs. Dick, which I'll get to in a second. It also had a Katia Angelina two-hander tour. It was an all-Canadian season, unheard of. Okay, so what happened was in late spring, after having announced the season, after having started to build sets, design sets, cast the plays, the board had a meeting from which I was excluded, and they basically decided to cancel my contract. So that's what I call the hijacking of the Canadian stage. I mean, after all of this building, and I think it was the right idea. What a national theater may or may not be today would have been very different then. But the energy of bringing Canadian voices and Canadian stories to the bigger picture, I think that was at the right. Now, what's interesting, the Can Stage just now has announced that they had, or a year ago, they got two $1 million donations from individuals. You see, that's the point, because the company has the stature where people are happy to give that kind of financing to it. And I mean, can you imagine what you could do with $2 million with Canadian plays? Anyway, so I think I was the right idea. I may have been the wrong person. I certainly got personally too involved in all of the other work I was doing, and I thought I could pull it all off, and I clearly didn't. But I think what really happened, why did they do that? I mean, why didn't they just let me finish my contract? Because of course, changing the season at that late date was the stupidest idea financially. It cost them another $1 million in paying off, contracts that have been signed and in switching tickets. And I mean, it was a nightmare. The theater came that close to closing. I was told many times, Guy, why don't you sue, wrongful dismissal? I couldn't sue my own company. I knew that if I did, it would be the end of the theater. So a couple of years later, the new AD and GM, Bob Baker and Marty Bragg, gave an interview to Toronto Life in which they totally deliberately blamed me for everything, and misquoted the finances and misquoted what happened and everything. It was like a really fictitious job, and so there I didn't mind. I sued Toronto Life, and actually made enough money. I got a major apology from them, and a lot of money, enough to live off for a year. And they gave me 3 columns in order to tell my side of the story. This is November 96, right? In here, I'm just going to, read you. The Not So Canadian Stage, published in September, contains some factual errors in the depiction of Guy Sprung and his tenure as artistic director. The opinions expressed were based on incomplete information, resulting in misapprehension of the facts. Anyway, it goes on like that. And of course, I didn't have a problem suing Toronto Life, and they published my 3 columns of basically laying the facts bare. Now, here's what's interesting. One of the shows that they canceled was Douglas Rogers' How Could You, Mrs. Dick, which is a very famous murder mystery story, as it were, in Hamilton. That drags in some of the higher class of Hamilton, and there's a murder, a body is burnt, and the limbs chopped off, and they all think it's this society woman, Evelyn Dick. So how could you, Mrs. Dick? It's all based, the title's based on the skipping rhyme of the time. You cut off his legs, you cut off his arms. How could you, Mrs. Dick? So that was one of the shows they canceled. So what happened was, the production manager, who had worked a lot at the Toronto Free and was friendly, phones us up and says, "Hey, I've got the set. We built the set for Mrs. Dick. Do you want it?" So out the back door, the production team gives us the set, and Douglas and I convert the Tivoli in Hamilton, which is an old vaudeville house, an old movie house, into a theater for this show. We sell 25,000 tickets. We actually invested our own money. And we made some money. It ended up at the Winter Garden. 25,000 tickets is probably more than the sum total of what the tickets that Canadian Stage sold in that whole season. Anyway, it was sweet revenge. And I better stop there. I didn't get to what I was hoping to, which was the discussion of Canadian works. What's interesting is if you go to the Can Stage website now, and you go to their history, they'll talk about the founding of Can Stage, and then they jump to 2007. They are so embarrassed by that interregnum between them, because Bob Baker, when he got to the Citadel Theatre, actually had his membership in Canadian Actors Equity revoked because of his behavior in the cultural of rehearsal. And that's the guy that Bill Glasgow, behind my back, recruited to basically hijack the theater, and it would not have happened without his complicity. I met Bill a couple of months afterwards. We had breakfast together. He broke down in tears, begged for forgiveness. He knew what he'd done. As a partner, you don't do that to your partner. And the problem is that in hijacking the theater, it has taken away what that theater is. There is no motivation. If you look at what artistic director Brendan Healy has written now about what the Canadian Stage is, it's just a bunch of cliched gobbledygook. We have closely listened to the needs of artists, consulted with our audience, and engaged members of our local community to help us determine our organizational priorities for the upcoming years. We have heard the clarion call for artistic innovation and institutional transformation. This plan brings support to artists, inspiration to audiences, solace to communities, and new ideas to the sector. Anyway, it's clearly, it's management consultant speak. And I don't know, the theater has shrunk from what it was in 88, 89, 90. It's shrunk to a mere shadow of what it used to be, but that's not worrisome. What's worrisome is it doesn't really know what it wants to be. And the dreams that we had to build a stage, a flagship for Canadian writers with quality that rivaled the English stage company for what it was able to do for writers and Canadian theatre. Unfortunately, that we'll have to wait for maybe another decade. Anyway, I'm sorry to have bored you with all of this. I didn't get to everything that I was hoping for. I still can't figure out why the board did it the way they did it. It did not make any sense. It made, I think they were thinking like shock capitalism, right? Naomi Klein, let's create a crisis and then we can go cap in hand to the authorities and say, bail us out or else we'll go under. They basically took the rug out from underneath the raison d'etre of that theater. And in doing so, I don't, I'm in a good place personally. So it's not personal, although I lost some serious money in having to sell a house after the president of the board, the aptly named Mr. Leach, made me promise to stay on after my contract ended, I actually bought a house then, given thinking I had a job. And then I had to sell it just in the one time when real estate in Toronto dipped. But anyway, I'm very lucky to be personally where I am. What is sad is what that hijacking did in terms of affecting Canadian theater and the future, where it is now, and the strength of it. It's I think just as all my work as a freelance and at Toronto Free mirrored the energy that we were surrounded with, the hunger for an audience. I think that hijacking of Canadian stage also, just like the free trade, but in a much smaller way, obviously, represents a moment in Canadian history that is actually a kind of a milestone. We got to the door of something, and then we slammed it in our own face.